Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm finally talking about the new album from Depeche Mode, Memento Mori. Depeche Mode, now the duo of Dave Gahan and Martin Gore, previously also including Andy Fletcher until his unfortunate passing last year. I can't imagine anyone needs me to introduce this legendary pioneering synth-pop and darkwave outfit. They're one of those bands who in the world of electronic music are kind of too important to ignore for how massively influential they are and how much attention they still garner all the way up through present day. It's been a while since I've talked about this band on this channel. Back in 2017, I attempted to review their last album, Spirit. And I find that video near unwatchable now. My writing was pretty shallow and undercooked across the board, and I wasn't nearly good at explaining myself back in 2017 as I feel I am nowadays. But even by my standards for the time, I totally rushed it thanks to that album's political focus, and coming at a very specific time where I really didn't want to engage in politics, thanks to burnout from a certain election. And my attempts to dodge the topic feel kinda cowardly to me now. The video also got a decent bit of backlash on top of that, though that was just from older fans who were mad that I was trying to talk about them at all despite not having grown up with their music. By the way, I did not grow up with Depeche Mode, just as a word of warning. In any case, I felt like I needed to take it upon myself to try again, go back into their stuff with fresher eyes. And when this latest album was announced, that seemed like the perfect opportunity to do so. Granted, none of this guarantees I'm actually going to please the core fan base. Even if I've now had a good 6 years to sit with a lot of their material, I still consider myself more of a surface-level fan of the band, and I'll still be coming at this from a bit of an outsider perspective. I like some 80s synth pop, but it's not my favorite genre, and by the time I was born, Alan Wilder had already quit, so there's no nostalgia for me. But I also feel like they deserve a second look that hopefully doesn't come off quite as shallow as it did before. Even if minor spoilers, I don't feel like a lot of my old thoughts have fundamentally changed that much, so here we go again. Here's my thoughts on their studio album discography so far. And of course we have to start with the album of theirs that I have by far the most complicated feelings on. Alright, I do have plenty of respect for Speak and Spell, being an early pioneering synth-pop record and a continuation on the innovations that artists like Kraftwerk, Gary Newman, OMD, and the Human League started. Hugely influential and likely a big source of nostalgia for many. But even when I first heard it, something never felt quite right to me. Back then I might have marked the production as a negative since all of these instrumentals are super primitive and simplistic sounding, but that's probably the best thing about it to me now. The simple synth arrangements sound quite charming. No, nowadays I'm not big on this album because Dave Gahan's singing feels like a poor fit for the cheerful tone of Vince Clarke's writing. Through at least half of this album, Gahan sounds sarcastic and like he's not buying this shit at all, trying to force himself through lyrics like, "Hey, you're such a pretty boy," and "I take photographic pictures." It feels at best like a put-on, and at worst like he's actively embarrassed to be saying this stuff. I do think the album gets a fair bit better in the last stretch, from Tora 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 onwards, and obviously Just Can't Get Enough is way too eternally good a tune to resist. But the rest comes off as pretty awkward and out of character to me. I definitely see how Clarke's later partnership with Andy Bell in Erasure ended up being the one he stuck with long-term over his short-lived stint in this band. This material probably would have been a better fit for a more earnest-sounding singer like Bell. And while there's enough to like here where I still get it if you love this, I've noticed the guys in Depeche Mode themselves don't really look back on it all that fondly, and I'd probably side with them myself, unfortunately. This one was a step in the right direction for them, though. While these tracks aren't quite as immediately catchy as the stuff on their debut, the remaining trio minus Clarke sound more natural working together, the darker and more subtle tone is a much better fit for them, and Gahan no longer feels like he's forcing anything in his delivery. Not great to me, but I do at least like it. It's a good project. Now, if you want the moment at which this band truly entered proper greatness, I'd have to point to this album. This was the first album with Alan Wilder on as a permanent member, and it feels like they leveled up in every conceivable way. The production is way more full-sounding, punchy, and satisfying, with a lot more interesting textures such as the quirkier industrial edges to tracks like Pipeline and Shame. The hooks and melodies are way more consistently memorable and striking than ever before, and the lyrics are markedly better too, with much more of an overtly political edge than any of their other albums, with tracks critiquing capitalistic greed like Everything Counts, insert joke about their current ticket prices here, or delivering environmental messages like the landscape is changing. I guess you could call it preachy, but I feel all of it is just as relevant and on point now as it was in 1983. This was the point at which I fully got the hype for this band. I'd mark it as my personal second favorite of their albums. And this one is basically a less interesting version of what they did on the last album. Production is still solid, but the songs are way more all over the place, with the singles being markedly more interesting than the deep cuts, at least for me. Blasphemous Rumors is an excellent track that outclasses everything else here, both sonically and lyrically, even if the message is especially bleak. People Are People is a classic too that still regularly pops in my head every now and then. And I suppose Somebody is nice as well, but I also think Something to Do and Master and Servant are still kind of annoying. And the rest was all pretty forgettable for me. Granted, a lot of people love this one, and most say it's a more consistent evolution of their last work. Even Paul Van Dyke has gone on record saying it's his favorite album of all time, so what do I know? But I just think it's okay. But for as many people point to Some Great Reward as the point where Depeche Mode really nailed their sound down, I'd say that honor really goes to this album. They really went all in on the melodramatic darkwave and goth aesthetics here and made it their recognizable trademark, delivering just as solid tunes as always with even more bleak and edgy and sometimes actively creepier lyrics than before. I have to assume they knew what they were doing when putting in an already kind of questionable track ostensibly about protecting a 15-year-old girl from the harshness of the world, and immediately following it with a track where the hook is, I want to see you stripped down to the bone. Classy. In any case, this isn't an album where you can, really take tracks out of context. It's probably the most tightly flowing album they ever put out, with each track intending to add something specific to the overarching whole. Very easy case to be made for this one as their best and most defining work, and it held up a lot better than I remembered from my initial marathon 6 years ago. But it's still not my favorite. That honor goes to this one. This is the one Depeche Mode album I've listened to the most. If I'm in the mood for their music, this is the album I'm most likely to put on. I think this one hit the perfect balance between having lots of great, easily accessible and punchy tunes and that greater bombastic darkwave atmosphere, both in the heavier bangers and the more languid ballads. But what really made this go the extra mile for me were a few weirder and slightly more experimental flares, like the bizarre breathing sound collages on I Want You Now, or the impressively over-the-top instrumental closer. I kinda wish they had leaned more into that weirder side like this a bit more often in their other albums. Now, this was the one that really got them wider mainstream success with all their most easily recognizable singles, and the album that I most frequently see marked as their best work by both fans and critics. Even Fantano recently went on record saying this is a 10 out of 10 for him. I don't know if I'd personally go that far. I think the way more straightforward pop and rock approach to this one proved to make it more the kind of thing that feels better suited to my family's dinner playlist than something I've ended up wanting to come back to on my own time. But I also can't point to anything I dislike about it outside of that or mark any tracks that feel like weak points. Cuts like Waiting for the Night and Clean still really hit in their darker atmospherics and textures. Tracks like Personal Jesus, World in My Eyes, or Halo have pretty hard-hitting grooves and impressive production. The former of those three has obviously gotten stuck in my head for many extended periods of time over the past couple of years. And even if it is a really obvious and basic pick, Enjoy the Silence is probably my favorite individual track they've ever made. Even if my connection to this album is probably more surface level than most, it's kind of the synth pop record, one that defines pretty much the entire scene and genre, and is probably the album I most recommend if you want a good starting point to get into them. Suddenly, the 90s happened, and the band started moving towards a much more rock-oriented and grunge-influenced sound. That sounds like it'd be less my bag on paper, and that is kind of the case. Though my personal enjoyment isn't actually that far behind Violator. Obviously, the songwriting isn't quite as eternally iconic, and there's nothing on the level of an Enjoy the Silence or a Never Let Me Down Again here. But I do quite like the sound play and greater sonic variety on display here, whether that be on edgier cuts like I Feel You, the synth orchestras on One Caress, or the surprising amount of gospel influences on cuts like Condemnation or Get Right With Me. They also never truly ditched their electronic roots, and a lot of the drumming here feels much more breakbeat-ish. There's still plenty of gems like Walking in My Shoes and In My Room that I mess with. It's not one that I really come back to much, but anytime I do, I enjoy myself. I think it's another solid effort. Now, a lot of fans I've seen would like to tell you that Songs of Faith and Devotion was the last time Depeche Mode put out anything of value. After that album, Alan Wilder quit the band for good and left them a trio, Gore fell deep into alcoholism, Gon nearly died via drug overdose, and Fletcher had a nervous breakdown. And yet they all survived and kept going, returning with an album that sounds pretty much in line with the last one, and honestly I think might be even better. It is much more long-winded, but the tunes are equally as good, and I do like the greater inclusion of instrumental tracks, with a few trip-hop and even very mild jazz influences along the way. Don't really get the hate some people throw at it. And this one, well, I might at least kinda understand the hate for this one, but I don't actually agree with it. It's a pretty big change in terms of sound and approach, and one that they gave a bit of a misleading title. This isn't really an album rife with exciting up-tempo bangers so much as it is full of moody and atmospheric, abstract down-tempo material, with a lot more of a modern IDM influence touch, care of new producer Mark Bell from LFO. May not be their best on a lyrical front. I did hear some kinda goofy lines like "the horniest boys' corniest ploys rhyme on the dead of night." Sure you guys don't have that one backwards? But sonically, it's a lot more up my usual alley than they typically are. I definitely fuck with all the cool abstract textures and instrumentals on this one and the brooding nocturnal atmosphere they all create, and I think the new spin on their sound fits them well. I'd say it's quite underrated. Though for better or worse, the new atmospheric direction ended up not sticking, and they decided to try and move in the exact opposite direction with the next project, trading out the moody IDM instrumentals with way rougher and grittier guitar-driven material with noise and industrial influences. Maybe even ending up a tiny bit along the Nine Inch Nails lines in a few spots. And, it's fine, I guess. They still have plenty of solid tunes, like Precious and Suffer Well, and I definitely respect the fact that they've kept trying to find new angles to approach their usual sound even this far along into their career. It just happens to be less to my taste this time around. Also not big on the blown out production, really isn't as satisfying as it could have been. Oh right, I completely forgot about this one. This might be their worst album. Which is to say, it's very middle of the road and mostly a redundant retread of stuff they've already done. There's a couple of tunes I like. I thought Peace and Come Back were pretty epic. Spacewalker's a nice instrumental too. And I suppose I was never gonna forget Wrong, even if probably not for the right reasons. That one strikes me as more unintentionally laughable than anything. But everything else completely blends in the background and disappears from my mind the second it's over. Say what you will about their last string of albums, but I feel like each of them at least had a specific feel to them that you couldn't get out of any of their others. This is the first one where it felt like they weren't even trying to add anything to the conversation, and it strikes me as only fitting that it's the only album of theirs to get nominated for a Grammy. This is pretty much the exact same album again, and I just happen to enjoy it more for some unspecific reason. I suppose this album flows a bit better. Gon and Gore sound more awake, have their heart put into it a little more. The instrumentals feel marginally punchier, and there's a tiny bit more sense of emotional stakes that I wasn't feeling as much out of the last one. Maybe the bluesier touches on a few tracks were more obviously pronounced, even though a lot of those tracks feel like they're just trying to recapture personal Jesus. It's still kind of just another Depeche Mode album with no twists again. Pretty hit and miss and probably not essential listening, but I don't know, I still had fun with it. It's at least decent. Well, I'll give them credit for this. Unlike their last two efforts, this was not an album I was ever going to forget. Part of that is just the fact that I had to review it, and so the hook stuck with me better, just thanks to the fact that I listened to the album more closely in order to write about it. But more importantly, as mentioned previously, it was their most overtly political album since Construction Time again, which should have been a breath of fresh air, but man did it hit such a viscerally unpleasant note that stuck with me for years after the fact. I was so turned off by it that I shoved out my review before I even had all my thoughts pinned down. Now, none of that actually has to do with the politics themselves. They're ranting against big corporations, environmental destruction, apathy, and the immediately deteriorating state of the world in the wake of the Trump election and Brexit. That was all perfectly reasonable, and I agreed with a lot of their observations. At least the ones that didn't point the finger at the general public, which wasn't a great look. But the real trouble was their openly defeatist attitude around the situation. They ended the album with a track called Fail about how hopeless the human race is, complete and utter musical despair with not the slightest hint of optimism or hope. The world is over, there's no point in even trying to fight or even keep living at all. And with all due respect, fuck right off with that. The defeatism may have been understandable for the time and fitting for their usual ethos, but holy shit was it not useful. Like anything in the world is going to get fixed if people just throw up their hands and give up like that. Now, for what it's worth, the rest of this album was actually a fair bit better than I remembered coming back to re-listen to it. The subject matter obviously doesn't sting quite as badly now that we're no longer in 2017. And a lot of the tunes actually held up pretty well, but fuck do I hate that ending. In retrospect, it's almost certainly my least favorite track they've ever made and kinda prevents me from recommending the album in itself. So, thank goodness there exists an album to follow that up. The second I saw there was going to be a new album at all, I honestly breathed a sigh of relief just knowing that Fail wasn't going to be the last track on their last album. And Spirit could have been their send-off after Fletcher's passing, even if Fletcher pretty much had no contribution to the band on a musical level, from what I understand. He was often described as the glue that held the band together, someone that both Gunn and Gore could easily get along with and made sure they didn't totally splinter off. And the fact that he was no longer here was enough to drive speculation that the band could be finished. And yet instead, his passing inspired them to actively try harder and keep going, maybe even try to communicate more directly with each other. This album wasn't designed as a direct tribute to Fletcher. Most of the album had already been written before his passing, but that theme of death and mortality was still kind of hanging over the project anyway, mostly thanks to the pandemic. And, I was kind of excited to get into it, since I felt like I saw way more universally positive reviews for this one than any Depeche Mode album has gotten since at least Ultra. I had heard bits of the lead single, Ghosts Again, which sounded like it was one of their best tracks in a very long time. That track and a handful of others were co-written by Richard Butler from the Psychedelic Furs, which many highlighted as adding a bit of a new sense of vulnerability and emotional depth that was missing out of many of their previous efforts. Granted, this is still late period Depeche Mode we're talking about. The chances of them diverging in any significant way from the sound and approach they're known for was pretty much non-existent. But I was cautiously optimistic from all the buzz this one was getting. And you know what? Even if I don't exactly think this is some incredible masterpiece as I've seen many people hailing it, I can confirm that this is in fact one of their most consistent and most easily likable projects in quite a while. The tunes and melodies are stronger here than they've been in a long time, and the sound design is just as solid and well-textured as it has been on a lot of their recent work as well. I don't know if it's as lyrically strong as I'd anticipated. In that department, it seems kind of more average by their standards, but hey, there's nothing massively objectionable there either. This is unquestionably a very solid album, a noticeable step up from the string of their last handful of releases, and even a bit of a grower over time. Though in the case of that above-mentioned lead single, Ghosts Again, I do entirely agree with all the hype that people have thrown at it. The tune on this one is very straightforward and more driven by its simply melody than pretty much any track of theirs has, since maybe Precious on Playing the Angel. But what's really surprising is how earnest the sentiments come off. There's no wallowing in morbidity here or attempts to sound edgy or cool, just kind of an acknowledgement that all our time on Earth is limited, that feels directly informed by the loss of someone close to them, a fond goodbye to someone they once knew. It is written in fairly general terms in such a way where Gore and Butler could have had this already nailed down before Fletcher's passing, but it is the track that by far seems most directly colored by those circumstances in their performances. It catches them in a genuinely vulnerable moment that even sees them feeling the need to drop all the usual pretenses and just present themselves as regular humans. And the way their feelings in the moment feel so real does actually get me to tear up a bit myself on most listens of it. It may be cliche to compare anything Depeche Mode have done in recent years to Violator and may border on a meaningless PR line at this point, but this one track is actually their best individual track since the days of Violator and comparable in quality to the stuff they were doing in their classic period. The hype was real for this one. But only that one. None of the remaining 11 tracks sit on quite that level of quality. I will also have to say the hype for Richard Butler's co-writing isn't quite as well-founded as I think a lot of people have made it out to be. Sure, he may have co-written the best track on the album by far, but none of the other 3 tracks he co-wrote turned out to be even close to that good. The closest we came was Don't Say You Love Me, which I do generally like. It has a typically nice, melodramatic tune, and the combination of the fuzzy electronics with moody guitars and theatrical orchestral string washes sounds inspired by like some old school torch songs and old movies from the 1940s or something. I've heard some people say this cut's lyrics were like the result of ChatGPT trying to write a Depeche Mode song, and I don't think that's fair. But it is very clearly nowhere near as specifically personal or heartfelt as Ghosts Again, and any allusions to death feel more like faux poetic window dressing than any actual attempt to wrestle with that subject matter. It's a solid track and one that grew on me with each listen, but I wouldn't put it among my biggest favorites here. The other two tracks with Butler's credits, however, are my two least favorite cuts here. My Favorite Stranger is a track that exists. It's Depeche Mode by the Numbers, and could have easily blended into the track listing of Delta Machine or Sounds of the Universe. The idea of the metaphorical stranger following you around and putting the dark thoughts in your head sounds like dozens of other cuts they've done before. Maybe that stranger is death, maybe that stranger is the ghost of someone you knew. It's too vague and impersonal to get me to care that deeply. And Caroline's Monkey. Well, at least that one's memorable, but I have no idea what the hell they were going for with this one. Is it about addiction? The coming end? Maybe even the environment some people have theorized? I don't fucking know. To me, it sounds like an attempt to be deep and profound by throwing like 25 different random metaphors and aphorisms at the wall. There's a woman called Caroline who has ice in her veins, is leaking through the holes in her skin, knows about the fragility of humankind, has a dream that never ends. And her monkey, who's crying and clawing at her back and cooing in her ear and running with scissors. What the fuck even is this? The whole chorus, fading's better than failing. Now that part's nice, but I could not take the rest of this track seriously. Maybe there's some deeper meaning there that better informs their bizarre wording, but if the intent was profoundness, they really only succeeded in sounding profoundly silly and confused to me. But okay, for as much as Butler's presence on this album turned out to be much more of a neutral addition that didn't really affect the dynamic of how Depeche Mode typically operate, I do think the rest of this album is quite solid. My second favorite cut on the album is the opener, My Cosmos Is Mine. The sound design on this one is so freaking cool, with all the reverb-covered blocks of industrial noise acting as percussion, going up next to all the cascades of synths and light pianos, and that dramatic breakdown in the middle where the track just totally switches and adds in all these theatrical harmonies and light string stabs. God damn, this is a track that is just as cosmic as its title makes it out to be, and the overall sound of it is absolutely freaking stunning. The lyrics aren't that deep, but the express need to be left alone and the want to not deal with all the senseless death does imply an interesting sense of barely contained desperation, the denial to come before the other stages of grief. And I also really like how this track ends up mirroring the closer, Speak to Me, which kind of expresses an opposite but equally desperate sentiment of still wanting that human connection and not wanting to fall into the void of loneliness over a similarly dramatic and cosmic instrumental that ends up disintegrating all its swirling melodies into some similar fuzzy percussion blends that sort of resemble the way the album started. That was a really nice touch, and both of these tracks are major highlights. Now, the theme of death may be one that looms over lots of other different tracks, but aside from maybe Ghosts Again, at no point does it feel like either Gore or Gone are at the point where they ever truly accept it. They know it's an inevitability that will come to them eventually, but a lot of the sentiments behind these tracks feels more like they're still not ready for it to arrive for themselves yet. Some tracks show more of an open defiance towards the idea of death. Soul With Me shows Gore imagining himself crossing over into the next life, but with a steadfast determination to do so on his own terms. Going over a particularly bright but morbid instrumental that seems mildly gospel-influenced. One of the most church-like songs I've ever heard out of Depeche Mode, which ordinarily I might mark as a negative, but did really stick out to me as a powerful moment. And Wagging Tongue is probably the track that seems like it might be most influenced by the pandemic, what with it seeming to regard watching lots of death happening all around you all the time and wearing out on you, watching another angel die, even though there's still that defiance to keep going, to not be silenced yet. Also, this track has another one of the best tunes and melodies here with its very straightforward synth-pop structuring. There's also a lot of tracks, especially in the second half, which seem to approach the open fear of the coming end, a greater desperation to keep living, but uncertainty for how long. Most notably, Before We Drown, which almost seems like it could be a metaphor for Gore and Gon's own relationship in the band in the wake of Fletcher's passing. I don't know if that's exactly what Gon had in mind when he wrote it, but the lyrics feel taken off guard by that newfound reminder of their limited time in the world, and They still seem to imply some kind of lingering distrust for each other, but still expressing a want to keep moving forward again. There's also a pair of tracks near the end which could maybe be using a relationship as a metaphor for death. Always You may have a pretty cliche sentiment about, well, the world's gone crazy, but at least you're still in my life to give me clarity, but it's delivered with such an intense urgency that it sounds like Gon is legit terrified of the possibility of that other person not being there. And that fear is directly brought to the surface on Never Let Me Go, knowing a breakup may be on the horizon but desperately wanting life to continue together over an even more propulsive groove that has some pretty nice driving guitar riffs on top of that. I mean, I guess these two tracks could just be about a regular breakup, but Gon and Gore's performances, alongside the intensity of the instrumentals, make it feel like the stakes are a lot higher than that. I like them more if I treat the depicted relationship as a metaphor for still being alive. The last track here I haven't mentioned yet is People Are Good. That one doesn't really connect to the whole death theme that I can see, although this one does also have a pretty interesting idea where I suppose Gore is directly wrestling with his own pessimistic and cynical tendencies. Like, his true belief at the bottom of his heart is that humankind is terrible and that people are evil. Because, of course. But he keeps feeling the need to remind himself, or at least fool himself into thinking that, no, people are good. If they do bad things, they could be hurting inside. They can fuck up, but that's not always out of maliciousness. Even if he's not sure he can fully buy into the sentiment, he keeps telling it to himself because there's only so far falling into complete pessimism and self-destruction is going to help him either. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite cuts here, but I do quite like all the inner conflict being shown here and the acknowledgement that human nature might not be so black and white. I'll certainly take it over the all of humanity is fucked and nothing can be done sentiments behind the ending of their last album. But that's everything on Memento Mori. I don't absolutely love this album. There are a couple of tracks here I could skip. The overall sound and style of everything is very familiar, with nothing really in the way of big surprises, and like all Depeche Mode albums, this isn't exactly the kind of thing I'd be in the mood to put on all the time. I've listened to it like 6 times over the past week or so, and I've gotten maybe a little sick of it too. But at the very least, I do get all the hype behind it. I cannot deny that this is their strongest and most consistent effort in quite a long time. The sound may be the same as you've always known, and it's definitely not one of their more creative efforts, and the only tracks here that I'd say I genuinely love are Ghosts Again and My Cosmos Is Mine. But I do think the majority of tracks on here are in fact good to really good. The melodies and hooks are a lot stronger and the emotional stakes are way more present than they have been in a while. Both Gon and Gore are really feeling these tracks and have their heart put into them way more. You can tell that this album did actually mean something important to them and that they weren't just half-assing it for the paychecks. Even if I don't put it on the level of a music for the masses, I'd at least put it on the level of albums like Ultra or Exciter, which I feel are more underrated in their catalog. I kinda doubt this will be their true send-off, like I've seen a few people theorize it might be. They are still in their early 60s, and while it's not exactly young, it's not that old either. They're not like 70s synth pioneers or krautrockers. Not to mention, given the tone of the album that seems more fearful of death than accepting of it and all the sentiments of wanting to keep moving forward in life, I suspect they will end up continuing to soldier on afterwards. But if it does turn out to be their final work, they will have gone out on top, and I would definitely be okay with how it left them. As is, I'm overall feeling a strong 7.5 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time. Bye.